Welcome to our group meeting for the container security group. Tiago is out today, but he has the first item, which is to put the improved container scanning matching issue through planning breakdown. I agree. I think we're getting to a good point there on the requirements. And at this point, we're just trying to answer the question, are the requirements adequately defined that we can move this on to start identifying implementation issues and weights and move it on to the refinement phase, or are there still outstanding questions about the requirements in this one?
Unfortunately, Adam, I think you're going to be on the spot here. If this is something we can move forward with the discussion today, we have enough people. I don't have a lot of context on this.
I mean, just for anyone watching, maybe it's worth just giving a quick overview. Right now, the container scanning engine is difficult to use for certain customers because of the way that it matches vulnerabilities. When you do a scan, or when you create a merge request against the master branch, what it will do, or the default branch, what it will do is take all of those vulnerabilities, compare them to the vulnerabilities that have already been resolved in the default branch, and it won't show those in the MR because it's trying to only show vulnerabilities that are new. However, depending on the customer's branching strategy, the way we're doing that matching today works for some users, but for others it doesn't. And again, it just depends on their naming structure and their branching strategy. Right now, all of that is hard-coded. We just need to provide a way to have a little bit more flexibility there so that we can properly deduplicate those vulnerabilities regardless of the branching strategy that the customer is using. So without digging into all the details of the matching details of all of that, that's the problem we're trying to solve for, is not everyone merges everything into the default branch. Some use release branches or feature branch strategies, and those cause problems with the way we're doing matching today. Adam, I know you and I had a pretty long thread in here about exactly how we would want this to work and what problem we're trying to solve. I just want to make sure, do you have any other questions about the desired behavior, or is it worth talking this one through a little more?
Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to figure out how this is going to be solved, because yeah, there's a lot of edge cases once you start messing around with the fingerprint, the matching out mechanism, and I'm just not really sure the best way to solve this.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, we talked about a few different potential solutions in the thread. At the end of the day, the solution is secondary to the problem to be solved. So I don't know if the next step for this one is a bit of a research spike, or, to have you or another engineer go and, propose a way to spend some time to think about it and work through some scenarios and propose a way to solve the problem.
I think a research spike would probably be good, because it's just too difficult to refine this as it is without understanding, because it's easy to come up with solutions that just that won't work. So I think, yeah, you need to spend more time really digging in and having a few different ideas of approaches and what are the drawbacks on some of them.
Yeah, that makes sense. As far as the requirements go, or the intended outcome of this, are you clear on that, or do you have questions still about the problem we're trying to solve for?
No, I think I was confused at first, but one of your comments explained what the desired behavior was, which makes sense. So yeah, I think I understand what the purpose is.
So we don't really have a research spike workflow state. So I think we'll probably just leave this in planning breakdown, but I'll add a comment and a note for Tiago that we'll want to do a research spike around this before we start creating the implementation issues.
So maybe it makes sense to create the epic for this, so we can create a spike ticket and keep them all, and start that grouping and keep them together.
Yep, yeah, we could promote this to an epic. That may be a good solution too. All right, so our next item, I know John had some questions about our epic for vulnerability scans against running containers. I think he's not the only one. I've seen a few questions over the last few days from the team, so it'd be good to just go over this again. One of the big things we want to do with container scanning, one of the reasons we moved it over to Protect, was to start scanning containers in production. And we've had some really a high degree of interest from customers around this. In fact, just for some historical context, back when we were Defend and we were wholly focused on protecting things in production, I would bring up Cilium, I would bring up Falco and AppArmor and all of our capabilities there. And the number one thing that our existing customers were interested in was, how soon can I start scanning the containers in my production environment? And I think a big part of that is because most of GitLab's customers tend to be either application security users or developers or DevOps teams. It's not common to have the SecOps team as a user for GitLab yet. And so actually implementing firewall rules is something that's fairly new, but identifying and fixing vulnerabilities, that's right in the wheelhouse of what our customers are doing today and what's in the scope of their job responsibilities. So extending that out to scan for vulnerabilities in a production environment is a very natural next step. And when we talk about creating a bridge between, over to that SecOps team, I think this is probably the most tangible proof point of that is going to be scanning vulnerabilities in running containers. That's an area where there's overlap between our existing customer base and our future customer base. Let me pull this up too, just because I think it might help, again, to have a little bit of context about why we're doing what we're doing. So I'm still refining this diagram. It's certainly not done yet by any means, but just to think about the different teams that we have in place, we've got compliance teams, AppSec teams, and SecOps teams. Again, security operations, they manage the things in production. So they're managing, they would be very interested in Cilium and Falco and AppArmor. The problem is that we don't have many of these users today. So when we go out to talk to customers and the people using our product, it's usually not this team. So we're trying to work our way over there, and we have a pretty strong presence with the application security teams today. They're responsible for the actual code. There's a big overlap here when it comes to scanning containers in production. So again, as we build that out, that's going to address the needs of the AppSec team, but it's also going to start to get the interest of the SecOps team to drive usage of other areas of Protect. So it really is that bridge that we're working to build between these two teams. Again, all of that is just some context around this particular issue. As far as the problems to solve here, why is it that customers are so interested in scanning containers in production? There's really two reasons for that. And one is certainly a far bigger use case than the other, but they're both valid use cases. The first use case is I hear customers saying, I have something that I've deployed 5 years ago. It may have even been before GitLab was a thing at their company. And it's just stale code, but it still is a valid production application. And we have absolutely no idea what vulnerabilities are in that code. We don't know what packages are being used. Like, nobody has touched that thing for 5 years, and it's embarrassing, but it's there, and we need to find out what's what vulnerabilities exist in that environment. Again, that's the #1 use case. And so, to address that #1 use case, it may be sufficient to just scan the underlying image, provided that the container is being recreated from the underlying image on a regular basis. But even that isn't necessarily a guarantee. So just having that comfort to know that they've scanned the actual contents of what's running in production is what those customers are interested in. The second use case is there is a risk that an attacker manages to get control of a container. It could be that they exploit a vulnerability in the code that's running there. It could be that they're a system administrator with privileged access that they abuse. Regardless of how they get that access, there's a possibility that they gain that access, that they then either have root privileges because the container is running as root, or they elevate those privileges, and now they have full control over that container. So obviously there are a lot of other aspects to protecting against that kind of attack, and Falco and AppArmor and Cilium are arguably better capabilities. But one aspect of that is that we do also want to scan the packages that are on that container, just in case an attacker puts a different package in, or installs a package with a known vulnerability. That would be something that we can catch. Again, that second use case is far smaller. Like if you're wanting to protect against an attacker, your front line of defense is probably going to be Cilium and Falco. But we do believe in defense in depth. And so having, a container scan against that is just one more layer of security to put on top of all of that. So as far as implementation, how do we actually go about this? Again, we have a lot of flexibility in that. If we do want to require an agent, or if we have to require cluster admin access, that's not ideal. But the feedback we've had from customers is it's more important to have the security scan than it is to not give us that access. At least that's true of probably 80% of the customers. So we would be losing some customers by requiring either an agent to be installed or cluster admin rights, but it's at least going to address 80% of the user base. And if we find a solution in the future that doesn't require that, that would only be a better scenario. But we do actually want to scan the latest, contents of that container, whether that's a live scan in the agent or whether we're snapshotting it with something like Docker commit. Again, there's flexibility there, but it's not enough to just scan the image that spawned the container. We actually want to scan, what's in the container itself. So I know that was a pretty long explanation there on this topic. Let me pause. Are there any questions or comments that I didn't address?
Is it sufficient to scan, like in the minds of, customers, is it equivalent to scan a snapshot of an image? Is that equivalent to scanning the actual running image?
Yes.
Okay. So they don't make no one's, made any distinction there.
No one's worried about that because you're taking the latest from that container. So if that container was modified from the original image that it was spawned from, you're still capturing that differential. So whether we scan the container itself or we scan a container image, that's fine as long as it's the current container, not the image that was sitting in the registry back when the container was spawned.
Right. Yeah. So with regards to that, I still need to do some more research to find out if that's even possible. Trivy does support scanning of tar files, but not the files. It doesn't support scanning of a tar file that's been extracted from a running Docker Kubernetes container.
Got it.
So that's what I need to figure out, if it does actually, if there is some way to convert that image. But yeah, this is something that needs to be figured out before we kind of go forward, because that would make that would change that so that we can only actually scan if we install Trivy on the running image.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, in the customer's minds, if we are able to do something like Docker commit and create an image from the running container and then go scan that image, that would be perfectly acceptable to them. They would not see any difference between the two. All right. Any other questions, comments, or items to discuss?
Actually, that example of like a user having a production container running for 5 years, is that something that they've had like configured and running in Kubernetes?
Yes.
Okay. And they haven't redeployed in 5 years, or a long, sufficient, a large amount of time.
Yeah, so this is like a fairly common thing, at least from the customers I've talked with, and they're almost always a bit embarrassed when they tell it to me, but basically it sounds like there was a project going, a team stood up this thing, they deployed it to production, and then, the project got deprioritized, defunded, those developers left, and so now there's sort of just this thing out there that no one's touched in forever, and it's running in production, and so it's a potential entry point for attackers to come into their organization.
Can they, and redeploying it, or can they even restart the pods? Like, do they have that ability?
They should have access. I don't think they've like lost all access into the cluster. It's more just that the developer team has, it's working and it's not broken. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, kind of thing. And so it's just been left there. So they still have credentials to the cluster. They're just not doing anything with it. At least the development team isn't. And then you have the
Okay.
application security team that's responsible for making sure that it's all secure. And they have no assurance that any of that is even reasonably up to date.
Okay. And redeploying is not an option?
Redeploying certainly could be an option for those customers.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because I'm just trying to understand, like, is it something that, because part of whatever our solution would be, something that would require having access to restart the containers, having access to redeploying, having access to all that kind of stuff, versus something that's just
Right.
there, can't be touched, and we need to, like, get in somehow into this container.
Yeah, so just keep in mind that for most of these customers, they're not going to have that environment set up with GitLab's CD. It's not going to be built from CI/CD today. So, they're not really, most of these things predated when GitLab was introduced to their organization, in other words.
Right. Okay. Because, yeah, I guess it sounds like each setup is going to be quite different than the other, and we might come up with some solutions that'll work for some of them but not others.
Right.
Now, I mean, there are certain workflows, I guess, that maybe might be a bit more universal, in terms of install this service into your app, your container, and then you can run a scan. But if there's things that rely heavily on the CI/CD workflow, that would be a pain point.
Right.
And might not be possible, because they would have to upgrade their whole architecture and the way all their containers are structured and everything, just to be able to use that facility.
Right. Yeah, and they're not going to want to do that.
No.
Because if it's been abandoned, no one wants to touch this thing more than they have to. They want it to go in and do a scan, find the vulnerabilities, and then go take that to the development team and say, this abandonware that you've built, it's time to unabandon it and at least fix these vulnerabilities, even if you don't do anything else to it.
Yeah.
So it's typically that AppSec team, looking for something to go take to the developers, because it's probably not being, built through GitLab CI/CD is a safe assumption for the majority of these scenarios.
Okay. Because yeah, like I said, the an easy solution is like where we don't have to reconfigure their whole workflow. It's just we provide them with some instructions that say download this particular application and then run it, and then it can maybe configure itself to run every day in their pod, in their container, and then it can somehow spit out that we got to figure out how that's going to work as far as like where's that report going to be visible. But that is much less intrusive to their workflow than maybe some of the other solutions where you gotta you have to work with our infrastructure with the cluster apps, or installing modules and agent K and all the rest.
Yep, absolutely. And so, and we may want to build all of that out too, but keep in mind that we try to be iterative, right? So if we can get a solution out the door and then provide a second workflow, the maybe for those users who are pretty heavily using GitLab in the future, we can always carve this up and iterate our way through it too. So even if we just get a solution that lets us scan in production and it captures, 20% of our customers, at least that's a start.
Okay.
Yeah, so hopefully that helps. I know not everyone who has questions on this is on the call today. So just, if you have additional questions, or if we want to discuss it again in the group conversation next week, please feel free to bring it back up and we can talk through it again. Adam, did you have anything else that you wanted to discuss, or Lindsay?
Not for me.
All right, well, thanks everyone. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
Thanks. See ya. Bye.